Hello guys and hello sir. Okay, now I will do presentation or explain about English debate. But before that, it's better I introduce myself. My name is Tudor Shotang, my MPM 2201030013, and my supporting lecturer is Sir Rudiarman Purba, SPD MPD. Okay, before we start our lesson, I want to ask to all of you, why we learn about English debate? Yeah, we know that English is the international language, but debate have the function specially to us because we become to a teacher. So we make a think critics and a good speaking. So, what is the debate? Okay, debate is a formal discussion to deliver your arguments about the something and the convincing people to believe your information. So, definition the debate ini adalah debate itu adalah diskusi formal untuk memberikan argumen kalian gitu kan. Argumen kalian itu tentang sesuatu. Jadi, argumen kalian itu bisa dipercayain oleh orang-orang gitu. So, have the kinds of debate. Ada beberapa macam debate. Kita tahu ada 3 sebenarnya. The first is Asian, British, and American. But this supaya kita tahu apa perbedaannya, because I want to focus in this British debate parliamentary. So the first, it is Asian. We must know that different British and Asian. The first is Asian. Asian have the 3 speakers and have the minutes time 7 minutes and have the POI, but time 2 until 6 minutes. But different in this British. British have the 4 speakers and have the time 7 minutes 20 seconds and have the POI. So what is POI? POI, it is point of interaction. Jadi POI itu adalah instruksi. Mungkin di dalam menyampaikan di saat lawan give your arguments, menyampaikan argumentsnya gitu, itu kayak nggak cocok. Why? Because maybe must the clarification. Mungkin harus diklarifikasi. Mungkin entah percakapannya atau tidak cocok dengan motion. Dan nggak nyambung dengan motion yang diberikannya gitu. So, apa aja sih yang bisa di POI-kan ini? Apa aja sih? Kenapa sih harus di-instruction-kan gitu kan? Kenapa harus di POI-kan? Mungkin ada beberapa halnya. Oke, kita pelajari. Oke, jadi definisi can be challenged. Jadi itu bisa di-challenge-nya, bisa diinstruksi itu karena ada keempat ini. The first is statistic, curricular, scoring, time, and place setting. Okay, the first is statistic. What is statistic? Statistic is the impossible to believe what the important things. Jadi statistic ini kayak like impossible, kayak nggak bisa dipercaya gitu kan, kayak wah apa sih gitu. For example, ini the motion, it is the food ya kan, makanan gitu lah kan, makanan yang nggak sehat gitu. Contohnya kita membahas makanan sehat tapi nggak bisa dipercaya gitu, nggak bisa dipercaya gimana? Iya itu makanan itu nggak sehat, this the food nggak sehat itu gitu loh kan. Ada gitu-gitunya, itu nggak bisa dipercaya. Oh mungkin ada maybe, mungkin ada their style your arguments, lawan kalian membilangkan ada maybe itu jadi kan nggak bisa dipercaya. And the second is curricular atau muter-muter ya. This conversation that in schooling are off topic. Jadi curricular ini kayak muter-muter udah disampaikan dari A until Z gitu kan. Nggak pas gitu, itu aja yang dibahasnya, itu aja dibahasnya, nggak ada yang bisa argumen lain yang bisa didapatkan idenya kayak gitu. And squirreling. Jadi squirreling ini adalah not what the motion requires. Jadi squirreling ini nggak sesuai dengan motion yang diminta gitu kan. Misalnya kan tadi motionnya tentang makanan gitu. Oh mungkin kita contohnya motionnya the students don't bring the phone to the school. Jadi siswa itu nggak bisa membawa HP ke sekolah gitu. Tapi nggak cocok dengan motionnya. Malah dia menjelaskan dengan handphone adalah hal seperti ini. Jadi gitu, nggak cocok dengan motion yang diberikan. And then it is time and place setting. Time and place setting to the fast time and to long time when giving arguments. Ya, jadi time ini seperti kayak mungkin dia memberikan ceritanya, memberikan arguments, ya give your arguments terlalu lama, it's long gitu kan, atau terlalu cepat fast kayak gitu. Jadi itu nggak sesuai because nanti ada di situ pekerjaannya sebagai timekeeper. Jadi dia itu untuk membuat time-nya. Kita tahu tadi dalam penjelasannya in this explain in this British have the 7-20 seconds. Jadi itu ada waktu 7 sampai 20 menit gitu. Jadi itu juga yang dinilai oleh timekeeper. And place setting ya mungkin dia tempatnya tidak cocok atau tidak sopan kayak gitu. Okay. The next is part of debate. Yeah, we must have the part of debate because ya siapa yang menjalankan kalau tidak ada bagian-bagiannya the person itu to the continue our the task their task gitu. Jadi harus ada orang-orang yang bertugas ya kayak gitu kan. The first is affirmative of governments. It is the affirmative thing, it is the party that agree with the matter or motion being debate. Jadi it is the support gitu kan. It is support the motion. Itu adalah hal yang mendukung untuk motionnya itu. Itu adalah grup yang mendukung motion yang diberikan oleh si moderator itu. And the second is opposition. It is opposition that it is the team that will reward or reject affirmative team's arguments. So the opposition is the support atau hal yang tidak mendukungnya kayak gitu kan, hal yang nggak mendukung, yang nggak setuju, don't agree the motion about that motion by the give the moderator, itu hal yang nggak didukungnya. And the third is adjudicator. Adjudicator is jury of the person who gives the judgment and follows the course and the debate. Jadi adjudicator itu udah tahu, itu adalah hal yang menilai, give a score to all of the group. Jadi itu memberikan penilaian terhadap orang-orangnya gitu. Nanti and the next have the adjudicator apa aja sih yang dinilainya kayak gitu kan, nanti ada kita jelaskan in the next. Okay, and the fourth is moderator. Moderator is the one of the communicate members tasked with the leading the events. Jadi moderator ini adalah panitia yang memimpin penyelenggaraannya itu. Panitia yang memimpin penyelenggaraan debate tersebut. Jadi dialah nanti memberikan motion, ya pembukanya kayak gitu kan, and the conclusion. Jadi dialah yang mengatur semuanya nanti. And the last is timekeeper. Timekeeper is one of the supervisors whose job is to monitor the flow of time during an incidents. Jadi panitia ini itu untuk mengawasi alur waktu dalam kejadian debate itu, untuk mengatur waktunya lah kayak gitu. Kan have the 7 minutes 20 seconds to give your arguments kayak gitu kan. Itu ada bagian-bagiannya, ada waktunya. Jadi ya kalau kelebihan waktu ya time is up. Ya mungkin the timekeeper tell the time is up atau kekurangan kayak gitu kan. Itu dinilai oleh timekeepernya. And the next is three things the jury exists. Jadi kan juri tadi kan tugasnya itu untuk menilai kayak gitu kan, untuk menilai setiap grupnya kayak gitu. Setiap kan have the two group, affirmative dan opposition. So have the three things that the jury exists. Ada 3 yang dinilai juri. The first is manner, second method, and the third is matter. What is the manner? Manner is a good way speaking, can be explained neatly, concisely, and clearly, as well in the body movements. Jadi manner ini kayak good speaking ya, bagus berbicaranya. Especially kita kan berbahasa, we speak in English, so it is lancar nggak, fluent nggak, kayak gitu kan. And the sign is explained neatly, concisely, and clear. Ya, dia harus menjelaskan secara jelas, jangan terbata-bata kayak gitu kan. Jangan cuma itu aja yang dibilangi. Harus jelas, pas, tepat, padat gitu. And the next is method. It is method that explain the sequence is good. Ya, ini adalah metodenya. Metode dalam penyampaiannya itu. Ada metode-metode dalam menyampaikan argumen dari pembuka. Jadi dia nggak asal berantakan aja membacakan langsung ke motionnya, nggak ada langsung pembukanya, langsung penutupnya, itu harus ada urutannya nanti have in the next I give the bagaimana memberikan argumen yang baik, give the good arguments. Okay, and the last is matter. Ya, matter is well represented. Ini adalah presentasi kalian, kayak kalian bagaimana menyampaikan gitu kan. Okay, and the next is how to deliver our arguments. Jadi bagaimana tadi memberikan argumen-argumen yang baik kepada lawan. Jadi nggak langsung POI. Jadi itu akan menambahkan nilai, ya mengurangi nilai kalian kayak gitu. Jadi kalau tidak ada POI kan kalian, wow, motion kalian bagus kan, berarti wow, ini nggak ada lagi yang mau perlu dikomentari. Okay, so how to deliver our arguments. The first is association, reasoning, reason, evidence, lean back. So what is the assertions? Assertion is your background or how to give a good and correct arguments. Jadi assertion itu adalah background kalian, bagaimana menyampaikan argumen kalian. You can improve your arguments scarcely. Kalian dapat menjelaskan background argumen kalian dengan baik, jelas gitu. Jadi itu background kalian yang kayak lebih kritis gitu. So lawan kalian mikir wow, it's good gitu kan. And the next is reason. Ya, reason itu berarti alasan. It is providing important points in the argument that must be clear or the concrete reason. Jadi, reason ini setelah kalian menyampaikan background kalian, setelah kalian menyampaikan argumen kalian, have the most reason. Why we choose that? Kenapa kamu milih itu? Harus ada reasonnya, harus ada alasannya. Yeah, because I'm just that because in this menurut ini karena ini jadi harus ada alasan-alasan yang jelas kenapa kamu memilih itu gitu kan. And the third is evidence. There is existence of the concrete evidence, not because the opinions. Jadi evidence ini bukti kalian gitu kan, jangan itu menurut pendapat kalian, your opinion. Bisa sebagai opini kalian, tapi itu memang sudah terjadi di kenyataan hidup kalian tanpa ada tambahan-tambahan atau pendapat-pendapat yang lain kayak gitu. Mungkin kalian sudah menjalani itu, tapi itu menurut kalian gitu. Itu boleh. Tapi jangan menurut pendapat atau pemikiran khayalan kalian sendiri gitu. Jadi evidence ini harus ada bukti-bukti. Contohnya, menurut undang-undang, menurut para ahli gitu kan, menurut para dari media-media yang lain yang betul-betul sudah diuji kayak gitu. And the next is lean back. Yeah, lean back is stretching your arguments well in order to make the jury believe your arguments. Yeah, setelah kita menyampaikan dari background, reasoning, evidence, harus ada lean backnya. So the jury believe your arguments. Jadi harus kita memberikan lean back lagi. Jadi saya memilih ini karena gini-gini. Jadi saya memastikan ini karena seperti ini gitu. Jadi harus ada lean backnya supaya yang selainnya bisa percaya terhadap argumen kalian. Nah, jadi gimana sih cara mainnya kayak gitu kan? Bagaimana sih really playing in the debate gitu kan? Oke, kita ini akan belajar debate British parliamentary. So in this debate, British parliamentary have the four speakers. We know that. Okay, the government. Government itu sebelah kiri dan opposition itu sebelah kanan. Okay, the first speakers, the second, the third, and the fourth. Okay, have the first speakers. Okay, the first speaker kita sebut the said is Prime Minister. And the second, deputy prime minister, and the third is member of government, and the last is government whip. So the opposition, it is the leader opposition, and the next is deputy leader of opposition, and the third is member opposition, and the last is opposition whip. So what is the task? Apa sih tugas-tugas mereka? Setiap pembicara, the first speaker, the second, and the third, and the next. Okay, prime minister. Oke, kita langsung ke contohnya, for example ya. Contohnya kita membuat motionnya. Motionnya yang diberikan itu adalah fast food. Aku tahu makanan siap saji. Misalnya kita buat kayak gitu. So, pertamanya itu, so the pertama yaitu, okay, so the first is, enggak, apa sih pertama itu? Okay, so the first moderator give times. Okay, so the first moderator give times 15 to the group to their groups. Jadi setiap grup itu diberikan waktu 15 menit untuk berdiskusi about the motion this give the by the moderator. Jadi akan diberikan motion dan diberikan waktu 15 menit dalam bicaranya, dalam berdiskusinya gitu kan. Oke, the first is motionnya fast food atau makanan siap saji. Kita buatnya contohnya seperti itu. Oke, ini sudah misalnya have the finish 15 minutes. Oke, so Prime Minister. Prime Minister itu adalah make the background. Jadi membuat backgroundnya tentang fast food. Itu terjadi fast food atau mention yang diberikan tadi. Nah, jadi akan diberikan background. Baru apa sih backgroundnya? Oke, dia akan menceritakan bagaimana dia akan membilangkan argumennya. Oh, kita tahu, for example, in this government, kita tahu makanan siap saja itu tidak sehat, kayak gini kan. Kenapa? Kita tahu karena ada makanan-makanan yang berbahaya karena terkandung bahan-bahan yang berbahaya di dalam makanan tersebut. Contohnya kita tahu di dalam saus itu ada namanya pengawet, pewarna dan sebagainya. For example, and then the leader opposition The leader opposition tetap menerima. Okay, thank you for your arguments, but I don't agree about your argument. Aku nggak setuju dengan argumen kamu, bilang kayak gitu kan. Why? Ya, nggak. Ya, kita tahu dalam makanan siap saja itu semua jadi lebih praktis. Jadi gini. Kita tahu sekarang sudah lagi, apalagi kita di zaman modern, tidak ada lagi membuat seperti itu mungkin. For example, jadi Prime Minister ini lagi mengargumen debatkan lagi. Debate argument. Jadi mereka berdebat lagi dan juga the leader opposition itu juga tetap the leader opposition ini juga berdebat juga. So, the deputy prime minister, deputy prime minister ini dia menanggapi si leader opposition. Jadi dia menyanggah dulu rebuttal dulu menyanggah dulu before they presentation their arguments. Jadi sebelum mempresentasikan argumennya dia harus berdebat dulu dia menyanggah dulu kepada leader opposition ini. Jadi menunggu. Enggak. Saya tidak setuju. Kita tidak gini. Kita tahu walaupun zaman modern kita harus menjaga generasi muda kita. Jangan sampai seperti ini gitu lah mungkin. For example. So, si leader opposition akan membalas, menyanggah lagi, rebuttal lagi. Enggak. Si ini enggak. Ini nomor 2 ini the solidarity position tetap tidak setuju juga. Ya ditaruhlah penjelasannya yang lain. So, disanggah lagi argumen debat dan argumen debat lagi. So, it is and the first and the second speaker it is the opening debate. Ini adalah pembuka debate. Jadi ini pembuka, the first and the second it is opening debate. So, and the third and the fourth it is the closing debate. Ini adalah penutup debate gitu loh, penutupnya. Jadi tadi kan sudah dijelaskan, orang ini sudah berdebat and deputy prime and deputy leader of opposition. Akan yang terakhir ini ngomong. Sip itu disanggah lagi oleh member of governments. Jadi dia dulu membuat apa lagi? Make the background or narration background. Jadi dia membuat narasi backgroundnya lagi seperti Prime Minister. Dia membuat narasinya lagi digabungkan dari the first and the second speakers gitu. Jadi dia dijelaskan lagi tentang Facebook itu tidak sehat karena gini-gini. Setelah itu dia have the 3 tasks about the 3 speakers. Jadi dia memiliki 3 tugas gitu kan. Setelah dia membuat narasi, dia tetap menerima dong, seperti yang the first speakers kayak gitu kan. Jadi dia tetap menerimanya. Okay, thank you. Dan dia juga membuat narasinya, membuat backgroundnya lagi tentang the first and the second speakers. So tells the arguments, give the background, and then barulah mereka membuat sanggahan rebuttal. Enggak, mungkin di sini dalam ada POI. Jadi POI mungkin dalam speaker 1, speaker 2. Oke. Setelah itu dia juga menyanggah lagi. Setelah mereka sudah sanggahan, pertama kan dia nyanggah, kedua ini member opposition menyanggah. Siap itu. And the next is argumen debat. Setelah itu argumen debat, argumen, debat lagi, berdebat lagi. And the next is the last speaker, yang terakhir speaker atau pembicara yang terakhir. Nah, jadi pembicara terakhir ini memiliki dua tugas ya. Pertama itu menyanggah dulu dari the third speakers of opposition gitu kan. Jadi dia memberikan sanggahan dulu bahwa dia tidak setuju tentang motion yang diberikan dia. Jadi dia menjelaskan baru mempresentasikan apa yang dibilang, dan dia juga opposition juga gitu. Dia memberikan sanggahan dulu, baru mempresentasikan, baru make the conclusion. Setelah itu dia membuat conclusionnya about the first, the second, and the third speakers. Dia membuat make the conclusion about the motion. Jadi mereka membuat motionnya kayak gitu kan. And the next is sama, the same of about the opposition group. It is make the conclusion gitu. Jadi NPO itu bebas ya, itu bebas. Ya mau kau the first speakers, the second, the third, and itu bebas ya, terserah kalian kayak gitu. Jadi itu nggak ada time, itu bisa menyanggah dalam setiap orang. Itu timenya ya mungkin setelah dia menyampaikan argumen dulu ya, after detail argument ya dikit aja, mungkin ada yang kurang ya POI, it's okay. So, bagaimana sih cara penilaiannya gitu kan? Bagaimana Bu? Give your score. Ya, kita tahu tadi juri itu memiliki hal yang dinilai kayak gitu kan? Memiliki hal yang dinilai. Tadi itu ada apa sih ya? Oh, ini ya. Can be close. Oke, ini ada manner, method, and matter. Jadi penilaiannya juri itu di dalam British have the six jury, three to group appreciation and 3 di group affirmative. Jadi itu memiliki 3. Apa aja yang dinilai? Itulah manner, method, and matter. Jadi manner itu diberikan nilai yaitu 40 ya. 40, method itu 20, and matter itu adalah 40 gitu. Jadi itu diberikan, itu setiap juri itu kan have the 3 jury, yaitu untuk memberikan nilai kepada pembicara itu gitu. So, and then until have the finish the debate, itu diberikan waktu 10-15 menit untuk merundingkan, untuk berdiskusi siapa yang juara. Nah, juaranya ini gimana sih Kak gitu lah kan. Nah, juri-juri oke, kan tadi kan yang dibuat itu ada 3 gitu kan. 3 yang dinilai oleh juri itu, that by the jury. The first is manner, method, and matter. So the first is matter, diberikan nilai itu 40, method itu diberikan nilai 20, matter itu diberikan 40. Jadi totalnya itu ada 100 kayak gitu. Jadi biasanya usually have the finish the debate. So the adjudicator give the time 10 until 15 minutes to discussion about what's the winner, siapa juaranya di antara orang. Jadi di dalam perjuaraan itu adalah person, setiap orang gitu. Jadi nggak grupnya gitu. Oke, di grup mungkin menangnya si group opposition atau the affirmative. Oke, setelah itu disampaikan, baru dijelaskan siapa juara 1 di dalam debate itu, juara 2 dan juara 3. Apa aja nilai kan ini tadi manner, method, and method. Jadi itu tidak sesuai grup juaranya ya, itu the person, setiap orang gitu ya, mungkin kan beda-beda. Jadi walaupun dalam satu grup itu ada melakukan kesalahan kayak gitu kan, ya itu belum tentu dia kalah kayak gitu. Di dalam grup itu teman-temannya itu kalah kayak gitu. So you more understand about debate. I hope you watching the video about debate so you more understand about debate. Okay? Tolong dengarkan dulu ya, so you must understand and lebih mengerti about debate ini.
Madam Speaker, it's no secret that prisons in the current system are abominable. We see prisons that are overcrowded, where prisoners aren't able to get services that they need, and there's an endless cycle going on because simply the services provided don't rehabilitate prisoners to a good enough degree, so that they end up going back into prison time and time again, and we don't solve the entrenched cycles that are seen in the prison system. We'll read tonight two main points of substantive at first with a model. So how do we see this actually working in the real world? We see that private businesses will now take over certain prisons within the public system, but at the same time they will also be able to create new prisons in this system of their own that can be more specialised and more targeted to certain demographics. We think this will exist under a contractual agreement with the government, that they will continue to uphold the standards seen in public prisons, and they'll be able to ensure that there's a humanitarian approach to this and prisoners aren't losing out in this system. In this contractual agreement, it will also specify that they must provide services to these prisoners, no thank you, and they must have regular checks of the conditions of prisoner welfare, all those sort of things. No thank you. Note these contracts will be relatively short term, as we want to prioritise the competition that can be seen under this system, and how if a company comes along and think they can provide better services for the same rate or cheaper, then they will be allowed to do this under this system, no thank you. We think as well, so if other companies think they can provide better services, this will be accounted for. Yes.
Private businesses are fueled by profit incentives. How do you ensure they do not cut corners on important facilities such as rehabilitation?
So as we've said, in these contractual agreements, it will state that there are provisions to be made for services provided. And we think that by having a system where competition is emphasised and two companies are able to compete of which can offer the best services, this will ultimately ensure, as I'll get to my substantive, that prisoners do get the best outcome because they'll be provided with the best services. So firstly, on this point of why prisons are more efficient. No, thank you. So as we've told you, there's an incentive for them to keep the cost down due to two things. Firstly, that there's a contractual agreement in place. This means that they must provide certain services stepped out in these agreements. This looks like things like education, catering services, providing that they have skills so that when they are finished with their sentence, they can actually go out, no thank you, into the workforce and get jobs and become productive members of society. We also think, as I've replied to in the POI, that this competition will exist to ensure that they are actually providing the best services for the price that is set out. No thank you. As well as this, private businesses are essentially applying a corporate structure to prisons. And we think this is very important for a few reasons. Firstly, it means that they're also employing, therefore, business management strategies. We see that these have worked in private businesses and they've ensured that efficiency is kept at an all-time high. I'll take you in a minute. This means that these strategies are put in place so that you actually are able to ensure efficiency within the prison system. Yes?
The Corrections Corporation of America agrees to buy state prisons only on the condition that there will be enough prisoners coming in and out of the prison. What is their incentive, therefore, to rehabilitate prisoners to the best level, if not better, than public prisons?
As we've set out to, it's not a matter of incentives, because what will actually happen under our system is that the money that's currently being directed into the prison system, into the public prison system, will actually, because private corporations will be taking over the prisons, what we see instead is the government able to spend money on prevention, spend money on the judicial system, spend money on things that will actually ensure that the entrenched cycle I talked about in my introduction doesn't continue under the status quo. What else do we see? We see that integrating other businesses is a possibility when private corporations take over prisons. This looks like things like private catering companies, tertiary education, programs for rehabilitation. This is really important because it means that they can provide this at the cheapest rate possible, but still provide services that are very important within these prison systems, and as I said before, ensure that we have prisoners coming out on the other end who are employable, who are able to become productive members of society. No, thank you. And as I replied to in that POI, it also means that the government isn't spending this money on prisons and can therefore spend it, no thank you, on really important prevention strategies, which we can all agree are what actually help solve the sort of cycles that we see in the prison system currently. Moving on to my second point about why prisons provide better services to prisoners. We'd like to note here that this is a very important point because it's because prisoners are ultimately the people that we want to see rehabilitated under the system. Prisoners are ultimately the people we want to see be able to be integrated back into society. As we've stepped out to no thank you several times, we see that competition for the best services is something that really exists under our system. We see that no thank you, when there's contractual agreements in place and corporations are able to fight over who can provide the best services for the cheapest rate, it means that ultimately the people who are going to benefit are the prisoners within the system who are now getting facilities they wouldn't have gotten before, getting programs that they wouldn't have gotten before. As we've said, this looks like things like education. Education is a really important point to note in the prison system because a lot of people who have ended up in prisons, it's because of a lack of education, it's because of the background that they've been in. And so if we can provide this to them when they're serving their sentence, this is something that will ultimately benefit society on the whole. No, thank you. And I think we can agree that education is something that will benefit people who are then going to be employable. We also see something really important under this system, and this is specialised prisons. We see that, no thank you, there's more possibility for there to be specialised prisons in the private system because ultimately there will be then more prisons. So this looks like things like women's prisons, children's prisons, things that can actually provide services for a particular demographic and therefore provide, no thank you, targeted services that are going to best suit these demographics. We think this is really important because it means that they're not just providing generic services, but they're actually getting the help that they need that's ultimately going to benefit them in the long run. Secondly, this also means that we now have more prisons in more areas because the number of prisons will therefore increase if private corporations are able to then start up their own prison. This is ultimately good because it means that firstly, prisoners don't have to travel long distances, and why this is important is because it means they can maintain family connections or friend connections, and they're able to have that interaction in a prison sense. This is good because it's been proven that rehabilitation is most effective when it's done in the environment. It's done in conjunction with the environment you live in, and your family and your friends are able to participate in that at the same time. So because we told you that we provided you a model that showed private businesses will be able to be bound by a contractual agreement that will ultimately benefit the prisoners, because we told you that private prisons are more efficient on the whole, and because we've told you that private prisons provide better services to the prisoners themselves, we are happy to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you privatise certain aspects of society and allow business incentives to deteriorate the fundamental functions of those aspects of society, no matter what restriction the government put on those facilities, corners will always be cut. And this is because profit incentive is the thing that runs these businesses. But note here that the corners that will always be cut are the things that are not tangible and are not obvious to the eye when going into these certain places like prisons. The things that will be cut are rehab facilities and the quality of those rehab facilities. The things that will be cut are programs, and that's really important in this debate. I'll be doing two things in this speech. Firstly, I'll be telling you why it is the responsibility of the government to provide these services, and secondly, why profit incentives means a decrease in important facilities. But first, just a bit of characterisation work. So we tell you that the private companies that we are talking about in tonight's debate and the competition that we heard from the opening government that will actually occur is to provide the cheapest facilities. This won't necessarily mean that there is like competition based on the necessary, like the quality of these facilities. The thing is that the competition will always occur towards profit and the expense of these facilities. We tell you that the government incentive to privatise is to make things cheaper, and this means that in the long term, contracts will always be awarded based on the people that can provide the cheapest facilities and not necessarily the best ones. So onto this first point, why it is the responsibility of the government to provide these services. We tell you that prisons are extensions of the justice system, and it's like ridiculous for judges to like determine sanctions and then hand that over to like private organisations to actually like facilitate that. We think that like no matter what the government want to tell you that that government prisons are inherently bad, like in the status quo, they still have a responsibility to both the community and the people within those facilities to make sure that they're actually protected and that they're getting the best kind of things. At the end of the day, privatisation will always make these things worse, and I'll go on to tell you that in my second point. So we tell you that the government has two responsibilities when it comes to prisons. We tell you that they have a responsibility to the individuals, so these are the people inside the prisons and that are like receiving these services. And we think that like the protection of these people within these prisons is extremely important. We think that this is something that gets lost when you lose the accountability that you get inside like privatised prisons. We think that when you get like overcrowding and people like pushing in more people to make more money, it means that you get like a lack of security and that like those protections inside those prisons go down. But secondly, we also tell you that the government has a responsibility to the community. This means that they're ensuring that the people that are returning to the community aren't necessarily a danger, and this comes in the form of like rehab, and we think that these rehab services will always decrease underneath the private system. We also tell you that you get a loss of accountability, and that it makes it much harder to ensure these services are provided, and I'll take you in a second, when you're not able to actually see them in the private sense. Yes?
Given that voters on a whole don't really care about prisoners, and most prisoners are disenfranchised, why do you think people would want to hold the government accountable to the like conditions of their prisons?
Well, it happens literally all the time. Like the things that come out about prisoners being like beaten by like things up in the Northern Territory, that happens because people actually do care about how people are treated. But also, let's note that what was brought up just then in that POI is exactly the incentive that the government, like getting rid of this accountability and this responsibility means that they're no longer going to care about the quality of facilities. They're always going to care about cost, because if voters don't necessarily care about prisoners in that sense, they're always going to be encouraging the government to give contracts to private corporations who only provide the cheapest option. So secondly, why profit incentives means a decrease in important facilities. We tell you that companies that take over these sort of prisons are fueled by profit incentives, and this is extremely harmful in this fact. It means that the objective is to make the most money, and this is really harmful. What we heard from the opening government is that the competition is what's going to ensure that the facilities of these prisons is always going to stay up. What we tell you is that this competition isn't surrounded about like the quality of these facilities. It is always going to be competition on who can provide the cheapest facilities. It's all about that idea of like who can provide the least amount of dollars per prisoner, and that's going to mean cutting corners in certain things. And this is because the incentive to privatise prisons from the government is to save money, and that's really important. So we tell you that there's two ways in which these facilities will go down. So we tell you the tangible facilities. We tell you that like things like food, beds, all those kind of things, they're things that could necessarily decrease if things were to be privatised. But we did hear from the opening government that like they can put in regulations, but we also tell you that even if these things like can be regulated, the things that can't be regulated are the things that happen underneath the surfaces and where quality is really important. We're telling you about like things like programs and security within those prisons. Yes?
When we privatised ambulances in certain states, we've seen them come faster, being better and more efficient. Why do you think this is so intrinsically different from prison systems when we've seen privatisation work here and in many cases in the past?
So note that there's little political capital to actually protect the incentives of prisoners, right? We're always going to be looking at them with a dollar sign, and we're going to be looking at the facilities that you provide those prisoners based on how much money you spend on them. Ambulances are something that people really like. It is important for a lot of people in society, it's valued in society, and therefore the importance of that facility is really important to people in society. But the fact is that prisoners will always have their needs and their benefits cut for this certain reasons. So secondly, why programs and securities will decrease. And we tell you this in terms of rehab facilities will become a lot worse. They'll lose quality and people won't necessarily get the same outcomes they were under our side of the house. But we also tell you that overcrowding that can occur will mean that there's less security within these prisons, and that's inherently bad. Note that these are things that can't necessarily be checked with regular visits to these prisons, and they aren't necessarily things that can be regulated, and that's extremely harmful. We tell you that it's really bad for rehab to be the thing that is compromised in this case, because rehab is so extremely important. It determines the people introduced back into society, and then you're therefore endangering the community if you're introducing people that are inherently dangerous. But we also tell you about repeat offenders, and that people are more likely to go back without proper rehab. We also tell you that if you are introducing a model in which businesses are fueled by cost per prisoner, that it is very likely that these companies have incentive to make sure that people do come back because they are being paid per prisoner that do re-enter that system, and that means that rehab will always go down. It is because it is the responsibility of the government to provide these services, not only for the individuals but the community, but also that the profit incentives of businesses means that there will be a decrease in port facilities that we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition has been willing to tell us that privatisation and all it does is simply decrease services, decrease costs, and come at a net negative to society. But when you look in the past and you look at the number of things we've privatised over the last 30 years, we've seen that the privatisation of government services has led to better services that are cheaper and are better for people across Australia and better at providing the very services that these people need. In response to a POI, we were told that the only difference between ambulance services and the success we've got there and private prisons is that people care about ambulance services. But at the same time, they wanted to tell us that there was an incentive currently for people to actually hold the government responsible for the prison system. This was a conflict in their case that was never resolved and would actually come to serve it some trouble. 4 points. Firstly, I will address whether or not it's the government's responsibility, no thank you, to actually do this. Secondly, I'll talk to you about why or why not the profit incentive is actually bringing better services. Finally, in substantive, I'll tell you how the government currently is very, very bad at improving services in prison. And finally, the second point substantive, I'll tell you that the private prison system is actually better at integrating people back into the workforce when they leave prisons and the government under the status quo. No, thank you. So on this first point of government responsibility, what we heard from them, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's the government's responsibility to take care of these prisoners, basically because they're citizens of society and that they fall into a cycle. What we say here is that it's actually not the government's responsibility, it's the government's responsibility to take care of these prisoners, but whether or not this care materialises in governments controlling these prisons or private companies controlling prisons is actually not the matter here. What the government needs is the best services for these people. So this point was always actually contingent on proving that the prison system was going to be better off under this. So in the end of the day, this point didn't actually matter all that much. But finally, it came down to the profit incentive here. And we actually saw the profit incentive and what was essentially capitalism and free market capitalism be completely demonised by the opposition here, when we've actually seen it be the driving force of change and good change in our society for the past 50 years. Because let's just talk about what the profit incentive actually means under our model. The profit incentive under our model means that companies actually bid contractually to provide better services when they think they can run it for lower prices. So let's just take an example. We've got one private prison company here, no thank you, providing services currently at a certain price. After their contract comes up, another company could come along and say, we can provide better services for this same price or less, and we're willing to do this instead. They win the contract and that goes into them. There's an accountability for them to actually fulfill this contract, and I'll go into why soon, that we're actually able to better hold them accountable and change it. But at the end of the day, what we've seen as the profit incentive is actually done a whole lot for many things in the past. We've lots in the past. We've seen, I'll tell you in a moment, we've seen, as I've already said, when we privatise something with ambulance services, something of great importance, right? If ambulances come 30 seconds or a minute later, it can cause big problems. But what we've seen when we've done this in certain states is we've seen quicker ambulances and better ambulances and more lives being saved. This is the profit incentive in action. This is the profit incentive working to actually bring better services. Yes?
Can you explain what's the point of purchasing a prison if you're not going to be making a profit from it, but you're still going to be putting in a huge amount of resources?
So the thing to note here is that the government in some cases does make a profit from prisons. You look at the labour currently that they do in prisons and the unpaid labour they do is actually net benefit for government and is actually used for profit. We think on both sides of the house, there's actually some benefits coming from prisons in prisons. We see this happen whether or not the government or the private businesses come. But let's just note that these companies actually making some profits off these people isn't necessarily a bad thing. We see that especially in other countries where this is seen, what we've actually seen is private prisons having these people work in ways that actually is better able to integrate them into private enterprise and private business, which they'll come once they come out of prison. This labour is actually benefiting the private company, but it's also preparing these people to integrate into these private companies when they've left the prison. So just to say, because there's the idea that because they're making a profit off something that the public cares about and actually needs good services, the bad thing is actually quite fallacious. It's not actually true. But now onto accountability. No, thank you. So finally, this is where it really came down, because when they told us on their side of the house that the main problem with these private prison systems is that we could never hold them accountable. But no, thank you. But I'll tell you why we can. But firstly, let's look at what we have now. The current system in which the government controls prisons actually has very, very little accountability, because the whole bureaucracy of government is actually involved in actually covering up the very problems that are our prisons, ladies and gentlemen. We see there's very little way to hold these people accountable. No, thank you, hold these people accountable. There's actually no way to hold them accountable in the first place. We think we've actually seen this time and time again. We've seen to be when there actually is stuff happening in prisons. I'll take you in a moment. Really bad things happening in prisons. There may be public outrage, but we've yet to see the government and the bureaucratic system that comes around the government actually to do anything about this. Yes.
How do you propose that these private businesses continue to provide cheaper services and facilities without decreasing the quality of those facilities?
So here we go. This is the exact same reason they're able to actually hold things better accountable, because they can apply a management structure to prisons, which is something the government can never do. These management structures are the reasons that private enterprises in the first place and private businesses are so profitable. It's because that these people actually know how to run businesses, and when you run these things like a business, what you provide is better services and cheaper services. This is why people consume private goods, ladies and gentlemen, and goods provided by private companies, because they are better and they are cheaper, and that's what comes with this. But finally, we'll tell you on this final policy standard that we're actually better at integrating people into the workforce in the future. Because what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is these private companies actually have direct relations with private companies outside of these prisons. We see that generally there's connections between them. They know what these people need to actually go back into it a whole lot more than the government does, ladies and gentlemen. These private companies know what prisoners need to be employed and what prisoners need to find jobs. We've seen time and time again that they're actually better able to train people in prison because of this, to find actually jobs outside of prison. We've actually seen the countries in America, for example, which we can demonize over and over again, and the opposition will try to do. We see the prisoners that come out of private prisons actually are more employed more quickly and find better employment than those come out of the few public prisons in America. So it's because of the profit incentive actually is better for prisoners and not bad for it. And that actually these companies making any profit off these people is not necessarily a bad thing, and that we hold them to more account on our side of the house, that we were very, very happy for prisons to be privatised.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I bring you one question in rebuttal, and then I'll bring you one piece of substantive. So moving on to my question in rebuttal. Which sides provide the better services for prisoners? And this has kind of been the crux of the debate so far. So this links both the principle side and the practical side of this debate, because it talks about what the role of the government actually should be and what provides the best services in terms of rehabilitation, punishment, and also like providing the education and the catering to the prisoners. So today we've heard a lot of arguments under which side provides the better services for prisoners, and I'm going to talk about the key four arguments that we've heard under these ideas, and I'll address each of them in turn. So firstly, the opposition has argued that these corporations will be provided with a contract which requires that they provide a certain number of services, including education and catering and all these other things that prisoners need. And their argument kind of relied on the fact that these contracts will lead to these prisoners receiving the services that they require, and they thank you. However, we tell you that the role of a corporation is to increase revenue and decrease costs so that they can create as much profit as possible. In this way, they will always be cutting the corners on this contract and fulfilling the bare minimum just so they can fulfill this contract, and therefore reduce the costs as much as possible and therefore create as much profit as possible. In this way, corporations will always have the incentive to fulfill the bare minimum. Moreover, no thank you. A lot of what actually takes place in these prisons and leads to successful rehabilitation is the intangible things, as our opening speaker says. Things such as rehabilitation that leads to the success of these prison services. And these intangible things can't necessarily be written down in a contract, and they are so important, and therefore we tell you that this contract will not necessarily provide the services that lead to a successful prison. No, thank you. The second issue is that we've been brought is that the corporate business structure will provide better services as they can provide a greater efficiency. The example here that they gave us was of ambulances and how when ambulance became privatised, they were able to perform at a better standard. However, we tell you that ambulances, no thank you, are extremely different to prisons in that the goal of an ambulance is to pick up the patient and bring them to a hospital as fast as possible. Prisons are far, far more complex. There's hugely different cost structures and a whole different range of purposes that make it far, far more difficult for it to be run under a corporate structure, because when you're cutting the cost, it actually leads to significantly different services, and it can't just be measured by the time from getting to a house to a hospital, and therefore we tell you that these two issues aren't analogous. Yes, please.
Why does the government not have the same motive to cut corners and save money?
we tell you that the government doesn't have the same incentive to cut corners because they are not guided by this contract that tells them each of these points that they have to fulfill. They're actually looking at it from a holistic purpose in actually creating the best rehabilitation for these prisoners, and they're not driven by getting the most money. No, thank you. The third idea that we've heard from them is that the competition between corporations will be beneficial. I have two responses to this. Firstly, as our opening speaker said, this competition will always be driven by cost reduction and not necessarily by the services they provide. And secondly, we see that this competition is actually a really, really harmful thing. Imagine being halfway through a rehabilitation program and then a new institution comes in and takes over the prison and you have to switch to a new rehabilitation program. How is that at all going to be beneficial to you leaving the prison as a better person when your rehabilitation program has to be switched? We tell you, no thank you, that one of the most important things in a prison is having stability so that you can actually leave as a better person. And stability is hugely important for rehabilitation, and this competition will be extremely detrimental to this. No thank you. The final idea that we've heard from them as to why they bring better services for prisoners is that you can have more specialised prisons for particular demographics, and that by bringing prisons closer to home you can have better rehabilitation as people can be in prisons with their friends. However, we tell you that being in a prison with your friends is only actually beneficial when the rehabilitation is successful. And we tell you that it's far less likely that the rehabilitation will be successful when you're in a prison with your friends. Imagine going into a prison and your whole drug gang is there and they're all in prison with you, and when are you ever going to be rehabilitated when all the people that brought you into prison and caused you to do these horrible things are right around you? In this way, even if the rehabilitation is successful, it's far less likely that it actually will be because you have all these things that brought you there in the first place. Yes, please.
The privatisation of prisons in America has allowed government to have the revenue to open dedicated drug rehab facilities. It has brought better rehabilitation for opiate addicts. It has brought better results for society as a whole. Why do you ignore the government revenue that actually comes from this?
Well, we tell you that the main core of this argument is which is actually creating better outcomes for prisons. We tell you that prisons are the central idea, and even if by putting the money elsewhere you'd be able to get better judicial systems and other things, that if that comes at the cost of having a successful prison system and it causes the success of prison systems to be reduced, then that's something that we definitely don't want. Now moving on to my substantive material. Today I want to talk about why the privatisation of prisons would reduce the accountability of these prisons. So, we tell you that under the status quo, we see that the government is able to be held accountable when failings take place. For example, if a prisoner were to be released early due to good behaviour and they later reoffended, then the government would be held accountable. So why does this change when prisons become privatised? Two reasons. Firstly, corporations have a greater incentive to sweep issues under the rug because when the prison is relying on their reputation to be able to uphold their profit and their business structure, they will want to sweep these issues under the rug as soon as they possibly can. The second reason is that privatised prisons also have a greater means to push these issues under the rug. They can afford and have the ability to have PR agents that can give them quality media spin when these failings come out, and therefore help them get rid of these issues quickly. In this way, we see a diminished level of accountability in privatised prisons than under the status quo. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was really strange to me that the opposition really cared about getting better services for prisoners when they would so easily rely on a government that would continue to offer deplorable services and conditions to the prisoners simply because they lack the capital and they have no way of actually changing the situation. We on this side of the house actually gave you many mechanisms through which we could achieve this tangible change. So the main question in today's debate has been who is better able to provide the quality services that society needs. A few points under this. So firstly, the opposition said that due to the profit incentive of private businesses, they would not be in a position to provide the care that they would deserve. However, we have continuously proved to you down the bench that the way in which the system would work is where private businesses would bid for government approval to meet government set criteria on that they would provide. And therefore, this creates the competition between businesses that would incentivize them to obey these regulations and better provide these services for the inmates. And they also maintain that security couldn't be regulated under this model. We think this is completely wrong. We think that under our model, businesses would be in the best position to regulate the security and safety of the inmates because they can take the accounts, they can listen to the accounts of the inmates, take their take on how they're being treated, and ultimately this is a better way to keep them accountable because in private institutions these inmates are going to be less resentful towards the institution because it's not a government institution that they've been let down by in the past because they've been systemically disenfranchised, and therefore we can rely on our prisoners to give accurate accounts of their treatment and therefore better regulate security. Yes, please.
If the government lack the political capital, as you say, how is this competition not going to be just about cost? How do you encourage that competition about services?
Well, we think both sides of this debate face the cost problem, but the difference is that our side have more capital and more resources to actually address these issues, whereas the government is just stagnated with these cost problems and barriers that they have no way of fixing, just because they are the only means through which we can achieve these conditions. The opposition also brought about this issue of stability and how stability is ultimately really important to maintain what prisons do and maintain that function. In response to this, we say that we have become so stable in the state of our prisons to the point of stagnation, and we think that the huge jump in quality, I'll take you in a second, that would arise in the care provided would justify this. Yes.
There's currently a royal commission into the quality of prisons in the Northern Territory after images were leaked of brutal abuse that was happening there. Can you honestly say that that's not an example of the public holding the government accountable?
Well, we think the public is better able to hold businesses to account because, when this happens, you get the same media coverage, except you can also, take out a lawsuit against these private businesses, in which case, compensation would be delivered directly to those affected. We think this is much harder to achieve against the government, and we think this puts individuals in a much better position to keep institutions accountable. As I was saying on this point of stability, stability is ultimately also a bad thing in the sense that prisoners actually regret the stability that the opposition is offering just because they resent the government and government institutions in general, right? People who go to prison have been systemically disenfranchised and have been let down by the government, and therefore they would be more likely to be be receptive to institutions that aren't government run, and so therefore stability in this sense, breaking this stability is actually the best thing we can do. No, thank you. They also brought about material on rehab. So as I've mentioned, so prisoners don't have come to resent government institutions, and therefore they have very little trust for government institutions, right? But we increase this trust by making these prisons be run by private institutions, and then we get we're probably going to get better behaviour seen in prisons, less violence and less resentment, and therefore more people getting let out on parole on good behaviour, and just generally less reoffending, just because
What information?
no, thank you. Just because prisoners are more likely to trust private institutions.
What information?
No, thank you. And lastly, at this point of accountability, before I get to my extension, we think we have more accountability in the private sector, as I mentioned, because individuals are better able to get compensation if they've been mistreated.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Now onto my substantive material, and we would like to focus on these issues in developing countries and how all the benefits that we have maintained that we have proven would actually be increased greatly in magnitude in developing countries. So in developing countries, we see a high rate of economic growth, but the government actually having very little capital to provide basic services to the people, and we think private businesses do a lot more for the economy and accruing well, and allowing people to maintain increase the standard of living as a whole. And so what do we get from this? So firstly, we get private businesses better able to provide quality services because they have more access to capital, they're contributing to economic growth, and because the government doesn't have access to this in developing countries, private institutions have more of it's a better mechanism to provide better services. Or secondly, it's also better for the governments of these developing countries because then a lot more money would be available to the government to spend on other vital resources for the people of that country, including infrastructure and hospitals and education. We see prisons in developing countries that are government run just extremely expensive with very little reward for the government, which causes a very loss of money, and we would fix this. And ultimately, why is this important? Well, because all the problems that the opposition have brought up today are just so much bigger in developing countries, and we think that the local community have a duty to help the people of developing countries, as the problems they face are just way worse when it comes to prison conditions, and therefore because we get a better quality of life for all citizens of a country and better standards and living and conditions in prisons throughout the world, we are proud to stand on the side of the house. Thank you.
Prisons eventually become the most important part of your life as a prisoner. Whether you were there for weeks or you're there for years, it is where you live, laugh, and lament. We have a responsibility to these people to give a fair and consistent punishment. Beginning with some rebuttal, principally we believe in three key things. Firstly, why is the responsibility of the government? That's been one contentious issue. Secondly, why we should or shouldn't let civilians dictate punishment. And thirdly, whether or not we should be able to profit off of suffering. So first of all, why is it the responsibility of government? Well, we see that when we have private industry, we have a massive conflict of interest going on. The option brought up how ambulances are a good example of private industry working. But as a private company, we believe that they would be breaking people's legs again if it meant that they get more business. Unfortunately, they can't do that, which is why we see them being good. But if they did, if they're going to earn more money for it, we would see that going on. Thank you. we need to be careful about how much freedom we give to people in how they deal with people. And because, like I said in my introduction, it's weeks or years you're in prison for, they have a huge amount of control over these people to get them sufficient to reoffend again and go back into prison. Thank you. Secondly, whether or not we should let civilians dictate punishment. We already make vigilante justice illegal, so why should we be allowing individual citizens to be punishing people if they're not part of the government? We elect governments to do that for us. We elect governments to run laws, to maintain everything like that. So we shouldn't be allowing them to bring in other people who aren't part of the government to do that. Thirdly, on the issue of whether or not we should be able to profit off of people suffering, we've seen what happens when you do profit people suffering. We saw the slave trade, and that's terrible. This is really no different. The opposition have succeeded that the benefit of prisons is you get free labour without having to pay these people. So how is that different to slavery? And
so put simply, the government can't actually review itself, which is why we see things like the Northern Territory abuse, which has been going on, but it's only just recently been revealed. Do you not think that in the private prison where there are regular checks done by the government, it's more likely that these sort of things will come to light earlier?
Well, that actually brings to one of the other issues of having a private prison, that when they do have the checks, they are almost always aware of when the check happens. Even if not officially aware, they get tip-offs, and that's when they improve the prison systems. We've seen that in other private industries, where they are ready for people to come through and do a review of them. They take advantage of that already, they're going to take advantage of it even more with the prison system, where the government has an incentive to say, oh, the prisons are doing fine, oh, look, they're doing it for really cheap, that's good. They don't want to see what's going wrong with that there. And there are ways to check the foreign prisons. We have royal commissions and things like that, which do proper reviews of the systems. No, thank you. And second part of our rebuttal, responding to the expansion from our the closing government, talking about private prisons in developing countries. Well, we believe this is actually a situation where it would be much worse when we have privatised systems. These are places where the government already isn't in that much control of its people, so this would actually lead to worse exploitation because they cannot give even an attempt to review these systems there. They as well have less money, so they're going to be more willing to say, yeah, you're doing some dodgy stuff, but that's fine because you're costing us less money. When you have the government running these places, you not only say the government, yeah, the government does know what it's doing, the government can control its own prison systems, but you also have that extra level of scrutiny that you get from a government through there. So those are the main bits of rebuttal, and I will now move on to our main expansion. So we're talking about how the variance between different prisons is much worse when you have privatised systems. So this goes to three areas. Firstly, why does variance exist? Secondly, why does it affect people in poor areas more? And thirdly, why women's prisons will necessarily be treated more poorly under a privatised system. So first of all, why will this exist? Well, the role of prisons is to provide a set punishment. When a judge lays down a sentence, you expect that sentence to be carried out, regardless of which prison you're going to. You won't want one judge to say, oh, I'll have 5 years here, which is infinitely worse than going 5 years in this other place, like it might be right across the road. You will get this because privatisation puts decision-making in the hands of the individual companies. And these incentives differ. So for many companies, we believe, as we can bring out in our opening, the main incentive will be money. But we also admit that some people might be good people and they want to actually help these prisoners. And we believe that those two different incentives will offer massively different prison experiences. One that might be exploited all the time, the other one you might actually have access to opportunities like education and training. You will not get the same experience under both these systems, which we believe is really terrible because the whole point of a prison is to, or punishment is to be reliable in that way. Yes?
The way you reduce people getting into the prison system is by providing sort of prevention strategies or programs in place, or even rehabilitation programs. Why shouldn't the government take up the opportunity to privatise prisons and therefore spend their money on prevention strategies?
Well, the prevention strategies really need to happen with the offenders, and the offenders are in the prison. So, the privatised prisons will do their own thing to encourage people to re-offend. There are, of course, benefits to doing it outside of the community, but we believe that they should be able to do both, and there's no reason that they can't under the system here. Because remember, if we just have more prisoners coming back in, that uses up the extra money that you say we'll have because we're cutting corners in our prisons in the first place. Okay, so secondly, on the issue of this variance, why this variance will affect people in poorer areas more. First of all, because of the economic situation that these regions are in, they are usually poorer areas, so the people who are running systems there are looking for a quick buck because they don't have that money to start off with. Secondly, because of the type of crime that we expect experiencing there, so we have more drugs in these poorer areas, drug crime, which the public really doesn't like these drug people, so they're more likely to be a little bit more forgiving if they do terrible things in here, which would, under a government system, not be allowed, versus white-collar crime, which would be in a richer area, where people are more willing to care about that, and therefore there would be some sort of level of public oversight, or even oversight within the prison itself, just because of how they unfairly perceive these different types of crime. And thirdly, how this affects people in poor areas. In these areas, we have a much larger volume of criminals, which leads to more people going through. And when you have more people going through, there's more incentive to treat them as a number, and therefore you don't care them as much. Therefore, it's not fair to treat these people just in poorer communities unfairly just because of the lost treatment where they were born. Third and finally, how it affects women's prisons. There are additional expenses with women, such as mental health, sexual assault, pregnancies. By necessity, you will need to cut costs if you're running a women's prison, and you will, because of these extra expenses, so therefore you lead to worse situation for these people. There's no principle reason why we should treat women prisoners differently, therefore we are proud to oppose you to all these three reasons and that one. Thank you.
that all down the bench, the opposition have tried to hide behind this idea that when things go wrong, the government can have a royal commission, can look into that. And they constantly use this example of the prisons in the Northern Territory. However, what we say is that to the point at which children are being beaten up in prison, if that is what it takes for a government to actually care, for people to actually go, hang on, something is wrong. If literal children need to be beaten up, then that's probably not enough accountability, and it's definitely not doing enough. And the fact that it got to that point is proving the systematic failures that happen when you allow the government to do this, and when you allow the government to run these prisons. Because the truth is that people don't really care about prisoners in society. Voters don't care about prisoners, and that's why it's never been an election promise, and things have never gotten better and never allowed to get to this point. 3 questions in rebuttal in this debate. So firstly, which side produces the better quality of living in prisons? Secondly, which side produces better rehabilitation services, and which side better rehabilitates against crime? And then finally, what is the best way for the government to be spending its money in regards to crime? No thank you. So, first question, which produces the better quality of living? And there's been lots of different ideas under this. The first one is competition. So we came out from the outset and held really strong this whole time on this idea that when you have competition, you get a better quality of living, because it's the idea that they want to have really good quality prisons, they want to have really good quality services, because that's what's going to get them the most money, that's what's going to get them the most prisoners. So we see these things like metrics that government can use, no thank you, the quality of their services, but also like who produces the least reoffenders, which I think is a very tangible thing. Unlike what they want to tell us all through this entire thing is that rehab, you can't measure rehab. If your prisoners aren't reoffending, then that's a way you can measure rehab. No, thank you. What they came out and said was that no, this competition is just going to be reduced to the cheapest dollar per prisoner, because that's what the government cares about. A couple of things to say on this. Firstly, no, thank you. If that's all the government cares about, then we can assume that the government is cutting these exact same corners, and there is no comparative that's being offered on their side of the house. The difference is, no, thank you, that on our side of the house, because we have this competition, even though they might be trying to keep costs low, what we'll see is a battle between who can provide the best services at a lower price. So for example, this might look like they're choosing to replace a failing program with a better one, rather than just pumping more money into a program that was never working. Yes.
Okay, you've given us this nice little summary where you've told us that if you have better quality services, you get more prisoners, so you get more money. Prisoners do not choose where they go to.
No, of course the prisoners don't choose where they're going, but the government chooses who they sign contracts with. So one prison can come out and say, listen, we can do all this, we only have 5% of our prisoners are reoffending, and we can do it for X amount of money, and then one says, well no, we've got 30% of our prisoners reoffending. The government's always going to sign that contract. So it's competing with other prisons to see who can provide the best services and the least reoffenders to get that government contract signed. That is obviously competition, not prisoners choosing where they want to go. That was never the point of that. So the second idea under who produces the best quality of living is this idea of accountability. So we came out and we told you that the government is not accountable until children are literally being beaten up. Why? Because we see that the most percent of voters don't really care about people in prison. The mindset is they've committed a crime, they've done something wrong, they don't understand the nuances in being systematically failed, and they don't really care about their living standards. We see that the people who do care about living standards are probably people who are in prison. However, in Australia, if you're in prison, unless you're serving a sentence under 3 years, you don't have a vote. These people are largely disenfranchised. So what we see is that it has never been an election promise. The government has rarely wanted to do something, and the conditions literally need to be horrific before they even start looking into them. No, thank you. So why do we have more accountability? What we see is that when there's a problem and a company owns it, when it's a face you can talk to, and when it's a service you actually trust, because note here that if your son's being sent to prison because he has never gotten a good education, because public education is terrible, because he has never had enough money because the welfare system is terrible, you probably don't trust the government, you probably don't have any kind of political capital. No thank you. When it's a company, when you don't have to contact the government if you think there is a problem with the way your son is being treated in prison, when you can actually call a number that is on that company, you can talk to a person, you can say, here's the problem. What we see is that firstly, 9 out of 10 times we think people who run prisons, they've been completely demonized in this debate. But let's just pull back. We think there are some people who run prisons who probably care and probably go, okay, let's see what we can do about that, let's see how we can fix it. No thank you. But if they aren't, and if they continue to have these really bad standards and continue to abuse, what you can do is you can take further legal action, you can sue, you can try and take legal action against. You can't take against the government. That is the level of accountability that they never got on their side of the house. No thank you. Right, so the third point under the better quality prisons is this extension we heard from opening and closing opposition, which was that somehow we'll get this stratified prisons, in good quality areas you'll get good quality prisons, and in poor quality areas you'll get poor quality prisons. We think that firstly the way that these private companies will work is that they'll probably not be, it's not going to be your next door neighbour who's running the prison. They'll probably go into areas, and especially go into areas where there's a large amount of crime, because that's where they know they'll get the most number of prisoners. So we don't think that they're going to necessarily be poorer companies just because they're in poor areas. We think they can come from all over the place. Secondly, we think that the government will know areas with most amount of crimes and will therefore want the best quality prisons in those areas. So we think that there will be this kind of service. And then finally, we see that the people living in these areas, if there are really high numbers of crimes in these areas, then they probably know people involved in crime. They probably have family members involved in crime. They're probably low socioeconomic areas. So you see that the people around this prison who can see what's going on are more likely to care. And these are the kind of people who, under your side of the house, have really no political capital and no ability to talk to the government to change that. However, under our side of the house, everyone has equal ability to try and change this. No, thank you. Second question. Why private prisons produce better rehab? So the first thing they come out and told you is that there's no incentive to rehabilitate because they need criminals in society. First thing we think, we'll always have crime, we'll always have criminals, so it's one of those things you always go with people. But the difference is, if you can show that you have less reoffenders, you'll get a large percentage of those criminals coming to you because you'll get better contracts with the government. So we think that there is that incentive to rehabilitate. However, not only this, we also think it's really important that the people in these prisons will respond better to the rehabilitation services right? Because of their the mindset that they're in. Because you've got to remember these people, and I've told you this in my debate, but these people are people who've been failed by the government time and time again. They know that. They know that they have been failed, and they often mistrust the government and don't like the government. That's why they've acted out, and that's why they've broken the law. So if they're then sent to a government facility where the government tells them that they have to do these rehabilitation processes, this just harbours more distrust and more hate for the government. However, if they go into a private sector, they're more likely to trust and they're more likely to openly try these services. Final question, really quickly: what is the best way for the government to be spending their money? So this is an even-if point where even if we assume that, which it won't, we'll get a slight reduction in quality in these prisons, it's still better to privatise. Why? Because it means the government's not spending money on prisons, and they are spending money on preventative services, better rehab services, and more things outside of prisons, and we would always value preventing crime over just spending more and more and more on prisons.
Here's the thing about crime, is that it's really expensive for the government to have a population that commits a lot of crimes. It's really expensive to hire and send out and deploy large police forces. It's really expensive to constantly have to provide public defenders for people. It's really expensive to have to cover property damage, and it's really expensive to have to provide healthcare for people who are affected by crime. So let's not worry about this whole political capital argument that everybody's been trying to be really esoteric about with this whole debate, and let's talk about this idea of cost incentive. Because let's note that when the government already has huge amounts of profit incentive to reduce crime, already has huge amounts of profit incentive to reduce recidivism, that is where you get high quality rehab, that is where you get good preventative measures and good programs. When you're talking about a private company who literally profits off of the fact that 77% of all criminals are commit recidivism, that is where you're going to get less quality rehab. That is a simple, logical link that every team so far in this debate has failed to make. So, in terms of principal argument, what have we told you so far? We've brought you 3 points. Firstly, responsibility of government. What we heard from opening government was this kind of blasé, oh, it doesn't actually matter because either way you get people in prison. But we think it absolutely does matter because you have a very strong conflict between the government interest in this case and private interest in this case. Because as I've said, it is very expensive for the government to have a population to continue to commit crime. And the government also has a responsibility to its people to lower crime rates because then people like the government more. The private company does not have that same incentive. What you have is you have a criminal justice system with one particular set of very real incentives, and then you have, you can start asking POs when they're not coming, and then you have a private company that does not have those same incentives, both apparently working towards the same goal. That makes absolutely no sense. That is why it was fundamental that it was the responsibility of the government. No, thank you. What we heard from the opposition, and this was really funny, they wanted to tell us through the whole debate that oh, but the government doesn't like criminals. But also that same government is going to be the constant fallback for our entire case because they're going to be the check-back point at every point where our case can possibly fall down. That was a really funny conflict that they thought we weren't going to pick up on. They were wrong. Alright, secondly, we told you that you shouldn't let civilians dictate the conditions that criminals have to suffer through. Never responded to. Thirdly, we told you that you shouldn't be able to profit off of mass incarceration. You shouldn't have that incentive to continue to get people back into prison. Never responded to. We win this case purely on principle. But let's talk about the practical points because that's where this debate really took place. So I've got 2 sort of outcoming questions. One of them I've called effects on states, no thank you, and the other one I've called quality. So in terms of effects on states, we had this point brought up a couple of times by the opposition of fallacy of redistribution, which is basically where they told us, but if we're not spending money in prisons, we can be spending money in other places. Firstly, the government pays private prisons, that's how they make money. No prisoner pays to go to prison, it's the government that has to pay these people so that they make a profit. So the government is still spending large amounts of money in the prison system. Anyway, second reason that the government already has these huge incentives to have these preventative measures and these preventative programs. We think that most of those are already in place. We didn't think that that was reduced or increased by either side of the house. We thought that the marginal benefits you were going to be getting there either way were almost negligible in this debate. So secondly, let's talk about this idea of accountability. Now something that hasn't been brought up in this debate for some bizarre reason is the fact that when you give people a resource like a prison, which is incredibly fundamental to the running of a society and incredibly important to the government, you then make those people very rich and you get a lot of them in the same place. You empower a huge lobbying group that has a huge amount of power and sway over that government and the thing that government does. What we've had from the opposition is currently prisons are never an election promise because no one cares. To be honest, that's probably better than having a huge lobbying group have a lot of sway and incentive and making it a government priority to act in their best interest. We thought that that was always going to manipulate the prison systems in a really negative way. We told you that we had checks and balances in place currently on the government. What we have from the opposition is oh no, but you get more checks and balances because a poor person who has 3 family members in prison, who cannot afford their own lawyer, who gets a public defender provided for them by the government, can sue that huge, powerful, expensive corporation and will get all of the benefits from that. No, never going to happen. That was completely ridiculous. And the point that you're telling us, no thank you, that convicted criminals can sue huge corporations for huge sums of money to get back the 7 years of their life that they lost to that supposed abuse. You had already lost this debate. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about this idea of developing countries. Okay, so what we heard was so they have poor governments, so we should let private people do it. Firstly, the fact that you have poor government and that your prison systems have such low standards mean that the bar is already set incredibly low for you, so you do not have to do very much to be able to raise that bar. That means the standards are still going to be very low. Secondly, it tends to have a much more tough on crime attitude in developing countries. I'll take you in a second. That means that you are more likely to have incentives to treat prisoners badly. Thirdly, vigilante justice is often rampant in these communities, therefore giving civilians more power and empowering them to dictate how criminal justice system works is always a bad idea, so we win this on principle. But secondly, the practical outcomes that you would get because of that low bar to start with are so small that they're almost negligible. Yes, please.
Why would people who have been failed by the government their entire lives trust a government?
Getting out of that. Okay. Thirdly, quality. Alright, this is kind of where the debate really fell down, because we didn't really hear from either side what anybody wanted to achieve in this debate until the latter half of this debate, where we had both sides telling we wanted to get better quality standards of prisons. So, firstly, let's talk about incentives and why they matter. Already talked about why prisons and crime is a huge cost for the government. We have an opposition like, oh, but ambulances. Yeah, okay, here's the difference. You pay for private healthcare, that is the difference. So they obviously have an incentive to provide a very good service for you because you are paying them for that service. Prisoners do not pay to go to prison. That is the fundamental difference in that case. That made no sense. Secondly, let's talk about our extension, which is this idea of variance between prisons. So we have from the opposition like, oh, you get specialised prisons. What we tell you is, no, you get some really good prisons where you do, maybe in like the best case scenario of their world, have like some people who care about prisoners. Note, they will be white collar prisons in rich areas because that's where you have the most political capital. And then you get the prisons that are entirely run off profit incentives. And like what we have from the opposition, by the way, let's just be a little bit logical here. The opposition told us that like, oh, you have a contract where you have to get the same services for less money or better services for less money. Okay, let's talk about something like food. Let's say I have to feed 5,000 people and I have to feed them like a decent meal. And I say, hey, I can do it for like $10,000 and hey, I can do it for $7,000. Obviously, if you're only doing it for $7,000, then it's going to be a worse service. I did not understand any characterization of the world in which you could get a better service for a cheaper price. That made no sense. That doesn't happen in the real world. That was always going to be bullshit. Sorry, that was always going to be untrue in this debate. And finally, let's talk about rehab, because that was also particularly important in this debate. And this is where this idea of trust comes in, right? Because if you don't trust the system that you're in, you're not going to engage with it properly, you're not going to be able to be rehabilitated properly. I don't really think that a petty drug dealer on the street who's been sent to prison 3 times cares who's running the prison. I think that person's probably just pretty annoyed to be in prison. I think that that's probably why they're upset. I don't think it's because the government is running that prison for them. But I also think that if they're in a prison that has been overcrowded, where they're getting less food, where they don't have as much, where their services are not being required as well, and where prison standards generally go down, which was actually conceded by the end of the debate, but they're probably going to be even less happy with the government at that point for sending them to prison in the first place. That's why you're going to get less trust, that's why you're going to get less engagement. I've spoken for way too long. I'm very proud to oppose.